capturing the effect of light in whatever subject we're drawing is often a part of drawing that can really intimidate beginners or even people who've been drawing for a reasonable length of time. And perhaps it feels particularly challenging when we're drawing in ink because ink is so, well, black and white. So let me make a few general observations while I'm, if you like, establishing the framework of this scene. This scene is mostly about creating the effect of light. But there are a few key elements, such as this railing in this boardwalk in an Australian bush scene, that do lend themselves to line work more than, if you like, more complex mark work. And we're going to use these more outliney elements when we start to establish the effect of light. The first thing to realise is that we're not so much drawing the light. Well, we can't draw the light. We're drawing the effect the light has on things. And in most scenes that we draw, the light is in the majority, as in things in sunlight or things where the shade or shadows are not so dark that we still can't see them fairly clearly. Sometimes we get scenes where that flips, where the amount which is in darker areas is more than the amount that's in lighter areas. And because this visually is so different, it can start to make us feel like we're doing something different, that this is somehow harder rather than just more of what we have in any scene where there's any shade or shadow at all. And in effect, the principles of the drawing of a darker scene are the same right up till we get to nighttime scene. And the important thing firstly is that we understand where the lights and darks are, the values of our drawing, of our reference. And particularly if we're not overly experienced with drawing very dark scenes, an incredibly helpful thing to do if we have a digital version of our photo is to take all the colour out of it, use the photo app, take all the colour out so it's black and white, and then find the contrast part and increase the contrast. Now, when we increase the contrast, we're going to do two things to what we're looking at. We're going to make the dark bits darker and we're going to make the light bits lighter. In effect, the more mid values will disappear. We'll be forced to go dark or light. And that's a really helpful way to really understand the effect of the light in this scene coming from whatever angle and strength that it's coming from. So I'm not saying we therefore draw it at that extreme, although if it's dramatic enough and in our mind improves the scene, we may choose to. But it's to understand where the darkest areas are so that I can manipulate those in my drawing if I want, and to understand where the lightest elements are. And look, it may be obvious, but sometimes where there's a lot of mid-ish value, it can be hard to see, to really make the distinction of what of these mid values are a bit darker mid and which ones are a bit lighter mid. And so doing this digital manipulation, incredibly helpful. And occasionally I'll even print off a copy of the black and white image and just put that off camera. I still always draw from the color one though, because there is more information to help me navigate the drawing process with the color included. But sometimes it's helpful just to be reminded of what those key elements are of the lights and darks, where the darks start to shift to be darker and the lights start to shift to be lighter. So all of this careful observation, we can't draw what we haven't seen, but we also can't draw what we haven't, well, we can't draw well what we haven't worked out in our mind. We have to have an understanding of what we're seeing that we can then use as the basis to work out how we're going to draw it. How our drawing looks in the end comes from our understanding of the drawing process. And for me, that's an understanding that I'm translating basically a visual, a photographic image into an image that's made with ink on paper. And ink that's put on the paper from a pen, so therefore it's going to be lines. Perhaps some lines that are so short as to be dots, and others that are longer, as we have here. So at this point, though, I'm still establishing the framework to create the light. So I'm not worried at all at this point about hatching for lights and darks. And you can see what I'm doing now is I'm establishing some of the closer elements where I'm actually going to draw the leaves as leaves. Now, I'm not doing many of this. I'm not doing much of this. I'm not doing many of these leaves. And it's only for the very closest leaves. But that's going to help this part of the scene feel really close, which will push the trees I draw further back, where I won't be drawing individual leaves. It'll make them feel even further back, because one of the important things I think visually about this scene, I mean the thing that made me want to draw it, was this track that winds through from in the heavily shaded area or heavily shadowed area at the front into the full sunlight as it leaves the boardwalk and becomes a dirt trail. And that the foliage, the trees that line this track, are in greater and greater sunlight the further back they go. So that's the key, if you like, light and dark balance I want. I want a sense of very dark closer and getting lighter and lighter and lighter as we travel that path, and then brilliant sunshine, so brilliant that it actually stops us seeing the detail as we get into the distance. So this understanding now of what I'm wanting to do and how I'm going to do it is now going to guide the sorts of marks I choose to create. At the moment, though, as you can see, I'm still doing the outline. But at the end of this, you'll see that the effect, the overall effect, most of this is going to come from hatching, from cross-hatching or simply hatching. So the challenge in a scene such as this that I have to remind myself at every start is I need to preserve the areas that are going to be the lightest areas, the really light values, because when I start hatching in a serious way, and I'm doing lots of hatching fairly quickly, it's easy to inadvertently put ink on papers or on parts of the paper that really are better served by being left white. And so I need to have a look at my reference and work out what areas I need to be really cautious with when I'm doing the hatching, to slow down and do less rather than more. And then at the very end, when the whole scene is finished, I can make any tiny adjustments if I want, add a little bit more ink to some parts of those preserved areas. Because it's only at the end that I'll really have a sense of, do I need or want to put more ink in or not? Or will the ink actually end up lessening the contrast that I want? Sometimes just a few little dots and dashes can really detract from the drama of what we've done when we simply go too far in filling in lines and tipping the balance of white paper to ink. So continuing just some of these darkest branches, these branches that are going to be really silhouettes that we have in the front, and I do want these to be darker than the ones behind them, because that will bring them forward. That will make them feel closer to us if the hatching is for a darker effect. And just add in a few more leaves of things. And I'm not being laborious with staying absolutely faithful to the scene. I'm not trying to draw everything I see here. I'm trying to capture the effect. And so I couldn't possibly draw the detail. And I find that if I start by drawing the effect, then I don't have the dilemma of where I stop. We're finding a different way of saying the same thing with marks. That's why this is translation, because if you like, my ink marks on the paper are the words I'm using to hopefully tell the same story that we have in the photo, but the photo has used a camera technology to capture an exactness, and then a 3-color pixel print process to print it out. So very different words, but I'm hoping that this will say something similar, but even improve on it. So now I'm doing the hatching, and I start with an area that I can confidently do dark the whole way along. And this is where I need to work out how I'm going to do these very light shadows. And you can see that what I'm doing is I'm basically just leaving the paper white, because these are high contrast areas. These are very high contrast in terms of very dark areas coming right up next to very light areas. And so I want to have that in this. And it may look odd at this stage. And this is where I have to not be tempted to somehow put too much hatching on, because the contrast seems too in your face, to use an English phrase, too stark. Because it's only when I've done all of the hatching, or at least most of the hatching, at least to a degree, that I'll start to be able to understand how what I've just done on that first rail is going to look. Because we understand values in relation to the values around them. And that means I shouldn't go too hard and dark at the start, except possibly with the areas that I know for sure are going to be the absolute darkest areas, and I want them very, very dark. And that's what I'm doing here. I am going fairly dark in a few spots, like that post that's up the back. That is a very dark value, and so I went quite dark with that, because I'm going to use that to help me gauge how light or dark to do some of the values around. But generally, and my approach with this sort of scene is go probably 3/4 of the darkness I think I'm going to want by the end. And then I leave that final quarter of what I think I might do as an adjustment later. And sometimes I don't make things any darker, or I only make certain parts darker to really tweak the light effect. If I find towards the end of a scene such as this that I've gone a bit too dark in my lighter values, and so the lights aren't looking as strong, I obviously can't take the ink off the paper, so I can't do anything about that. But because we understand values relatively, they bounce off each other to tell us what's dark and what's light. If I darken all of the dark areas a bit more, that will have the effect of making the light areas look lighter. And so that can take a lot of time, but it can be a way of ending up with a drawing that has the effect, when we look at it, that we wanted. The contrast between the lights and darks. Now, when we're doing this hatching, we also have to bear in mind the effect of the light on the, if you like, texture that we're drawing, what the underlying three-dimensional form is. Because it's not just lights and darks. We can still see leaves, and we have a sense of foliage and of branches and of ground. And even where the ground has leaf litter on top of it, we still have a sense of the form, the topographical form of the ground. And so I'm wanting to hold on to all of this information in what I do as well. But generally, I know that the front is going to be darker, and I know that this front right side, which I'm doing now, will be darkest in terms of a larger area. It won't all be the same darkness, but generally this will be the darkest part of the drawing, both because it's in shade and shadow, quite deep shade and shadow, but also because it's close to us. And now I have this this beam down here at the bottom of the walkway. So nature scenes are often a bit intimidating to draw when we draw with pen, because there is just so much detail, and it can be hard to know how to draw so many leaves and things without just scribbling and having it look like we've just scribbled or done a pattern to fill in large areas of tangle. But if we switch our thinking, our understanding, to thinking visually, what am I looking at? What's the effect? Not to worry about what it actually is, but what's the effect, and what's the dominant visual clue that we have, and seek to make that dominant in our drawing, using whatever marks work to do that, then suddenly we have an approach, we have a strategy that we can use to draw any scene at all. But it's particularly helpful when the scene is as complex as this. Please hit the like button for me if you've got to this halfway point and you haven't already. I do have a great video on 10 ways that we can use cross-hatching, 10 different purposes I use cross-hatching for when I draw. Personally, of my 1,300 videos that I've got on YouTube, free videos, I think this is potentially the most helpful for people, simply because cross-hatching is such a problem. And most of the teaching, I think, is quite, well, it ranges from inadequate to unhelpful. And it's unhelpful because it's oversimplified and doesn't tell you that it's oversimplified. And so you think you understand it when you do practices with little cubes and spheres and cylinders and cones and things. But when you actually have a real life scene such as this, doing those practices, watching those videos, doesn't really help you to know where to start. And you end up thinking there must be something wrong with me, I'm just not clever enough or artistic enough to be able to do it. When no, the problem was with the teaching material. It only set you up to do very simple things that probably aren't what you want to draw particularly anyway. So on this left-hand side now, you can see that I'm keeping this darkest part darker, and I'm really not doing much at all past that. I'm not trying to draw the things that are further in the distance, except just to establish lightly some of the trunks that we have. And that's just to help me with the composition, to be able to place the values more accurately. Because while I don't have to slavishly follow this reference photo, I do like it. That's why I'm drawing it. So I do want to have all the composition strengths that this has. Now, the other thing I'm doing here is I'm changing my pen at different times. So to do these closer sections, I'm quite possibly using even a 0.5 and a 0.3. And then for the midground, I'm switching more to a 0.2. And then I do use a 0.1 to do some of the furthest lines. And that lets me easily get a nice, heavier, darker line for my hatching, which makes it easier to get a darker effect and a stronger, darker effect. But when I go further back, I can do my hatching with a finer pen, and by particularly combining that with a lighter pressing on the paper and a faster speed, I can get very, very light lines, and I can get a greater variety of variation using the one pen for my lightest values, and that's going to be really handy. I do occasionally use a 0.03 or 0.05, but generally I find them just a bit scratchy. So that's always one of the techniques we can use when we draw, is to change our pens to change the mark, the way the mark we put on the paper looks. And we can also change our speed, and we can also change the pressure. Not that you can ever press really hard, or else you razz your expensive drawing pens, of course. So now I'm doing some hatching to indicate the form, the topography, the slope of this, because I want a sense that this is sloping down, and you don't see these lines on the photo. You do not see diagonal lines coming down, yet we feel from all sorts of very detailed visual cues that we get in the photo, we know that the ground is sloping down. Now, I can't replicate those in this drawing, so I'm using a different language. I'm translating into what I see in the photo into these 45-degree or sloping lines. And that, hopefully, will say the same thing. It will give the information we need of interest to the scene, And the fact that it's in darkness means I can, and I'm going to hatch it for the value, means I can take advantage of that I'm going to put all these lines here to create a darkness. I can take advantage of that to create the effect of the ground sloping. So this is where creativity comes in. And this is why simply trying to copy what we see is so inadequate an understanding of the drawing process. Because so often I simply can't copy what's there. But if I try to, at best I will end up with a very inadequate rendering of the scene that has all sorts of issues. I need to accept the fact that a pen is a different language to a camera and to a printer. And I need to find the words in this pen language that create the same meaning, in effect, that interpret my scene into different words that have the same meaning. And that's what I'm doing. That's the underlying thought process I have in all of my drawings, and it works for any subject at all. I don't particularly draw portraits, but if I did, it would work for portraiture as well. So now I'm swapping pens and doing things lighter. This is a smaller pen than the one I've used earlier, and you can see I'm getting lighter, thinner lines, which are going to create a different effect. And you can also see that I'm changing the direction of my lines as I go further back. There is some shrubs under those trees, that some in shade, some in sun, and so vertical lines will capture that effect better. This drawing in real time took me just under an hour to draw. And so you can see what I'm doing for these furthest tree canopies that we see in the distance with more light on them through these trees that are closer, through the branches of the trees that are closer. I'm not trying to draw leaves at all. I'm really doing some very loose hatching to simply reflect the mid-value that we have there. And it becomes more obvious if we desaturate, take the colour out of our photo and see it in black and white, because it really becomes an even more grey, single grey mass that sits behind the branches. However, we do have a very strong sense of the branches and the foliage that's in front. And so for that reason, I want to create, I don't want this hatching in the distance to come up hard and fast against the branches. I try and leave, at least in parts, a little bit of a halo effect, a little bit of white around the closer things. That helps us quickly and easily understand. This is closer, that's further. Now you can see what I've been doing with these leaves that I've just done on the right-hand side. These leaves are a great opportunity, again, to establish a sense of feeling closer, because firstly, they're fairly silhouetted, which means I can take a little more effort to try and indicate individual leaves. Now, not too much, because if I start drawing individual leaves too much, then it's going to be hard to know where to stop. But particularly just on the very edge of the canopy where they create a dark silhouette, that's a great place to draw just a few leaves, or really, we're not drawing the leaves, we're just putting a few small marks that represent individual leaves. Because when we look at this scene, and now I'm doing some closer foliage, when we look at this scene, those marks, because of the strong contrast, will stand out quickly and easily, and the brain will say, oh, they're leaves, this is a tree, and they're quite close, I'm seeing leaves here, so this is obviously much closer. And all of that happens, of course, without us actually thinking about it, but it helps to create the understanding that I'm looking at, different depths of plane of trees, of foliage, that's moving from darkness into the light. Now, one thing I really want you to notice at this point, because you won't be able to notice it later, is I haven't done the dark value on the path at the front. Now, so look to see how this looks. And I don't know how much hatching you would plan to do on the ground in front. But we already now have a bit of an effect of seeing the light in the distance. But look to see how much the overall effect changes by the end, which is only 5 minutes away, when I now really start to increase the darkness in these closer areas. Because when I talk about the way we understand values, perceive values as being in relation to each other, this is going to show you what I mean. So at the moment, yes, we do have that sense of light in the distance, but just watch and see how much it is increased by what I'm doing now. In fact, from memory, because I did do this drawing 2 years ago, from memory, I actually come back at the very end and do a little bit more on just to darken the part at the very front. So knowing how dark to go, of course, is another thing that we need to do. And you can see now how I'm actually building up the values further back with very light lines. This is, I probably used a 0.1 for that, layering very light lines that are really quite patchy lines because I'm a thinnish nib, holding it very lightly and moving it very quickly to create subtlety and variation. Because if we look at our reference, we can see that in that spot that I was just doing on the path towards the far end of the boardwalk part, parts are lighter, parts are darker. Little parts of the unevenness of the timber catch the light, and I want to get that effect. I don't want lots of precise lines because the Australian bush is a tangle of textures and light and colour and form, masses of scattered overlapping detail everywhere, and I want to have that feel in this drawing as well. You can see, yes, I'm swapping pens all over the place, choosing the one that will put the right amount of ink on to get the value that I want. And so having increased the value of what was around the base of that tree, I needed to increase the value to make darker the base of that tree so that it still stood out. And now I'm just doing a few closer bits of foliage that we can see the individual leaves for of this overhanging one from the right. They're not leaves on those trees on the left-hand side in the distance. They're leaves of this overhang. I'm particularly partial to foliage overhangs coming in from the top. And if you've seen a lot of my videos, you would know that. I think they're a great way of hugely increasing the depth of plane. And now I'm angling these lines here to increase the darkness without using a finer pen. And we have these bursts of light coming onto the boardwalk. Now I can't, in the time I've got, I can't draw them in as much detail as they're here. So I've simplified them so that they still serve the purpose, because those bits of light, it might be easy to disregard them, but they help make the dark look darker by the end. So now I'm really working on the relative values here. So have a look now at how this is looking compared to a few minutes ago, with the framing in the lower section. If I think of this as having a U shape of darker values around the edges, and towards the upper part and in the center, we have brighter light, but particularly going to the center. So I'm in my adjustment phase where I'm now thinking, okay, how dark do I need to make the places I want to be darkest to really capture that dramatic lighting, and therefore really highlight the work with the dramatic composition I think that this scene has as well. See, we have the dark to light moving from the outside into the center, but we also have these strong compositional elements of some of the trunks, but particularly the framing of the boardwalk and the rail. making a few darker bits in the midsections. You'll see here I'm just actually hatching over everything I've drawn because I want to create a sort of a shadow shade effect. And maybe I'll highlight a few individual parts to bring them back as well. It's all about now stopping and not so much looking at the photo as looking at the drawing and thinking, is it saying what I want it to say? And hope I haven't put too much ink in any one place. But I did reduce the impact of that kind of, if you think, secondary strong patch of sunlight on the left to the center, because I felt I wanted the single tunnel effect. So now I try and take the tape off without tearing the paper. So, and it creates a nice clean effect. What do you think? I'm just wondering whether I add a bit more to it after this. Maybe I do. So we'll just wait and see before I do my outro. But I remember being very happy with this drawing. It was a challenging scene for me at the time. I've done more of this sort of thing since, but I'll post this photo on my channel posts page, the old community page, and why not have a go? G'day, I'm Stephen Travers. We shouldn't be intimidated by lights and darks and by strong light contrast. If we think of it the right way and observe carefully, it's just like drawing anything else. Why not have a go? Hope you have fun. I'll see you next time. Bye.